Welcome to Bruce Hurwitz Presents Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Bruce Hurwitz of Hurwitz Strategic Staffing. I hope you will consider us for all your staffing, career counseling, and speech writing needs. You can find us on the web at hsstaffing.com. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Peter Rosenberger. We will be discussing connecting businesses and services to family caregivers. Meet the Experts is sponsored by P&K CPAs. P&K is a full-service accounting firm. They provide accounting and consulting services to businesses ranging from startups to small and mid-cap companies to nonprofits as well as high net worth individuals. Contact them today for a free consultation at pk-cpas.com or call them at 973-882-8810. They will be happy to be of service. Peter, welcome to the show.
Bruce, this is the highlight of my life. I am thrilled to be here with you, and thank you very much for just taking the time to talk about this group, this issue, this topic of folks that are not really considered when it comes to business and strategic development outside of home care stuff. And so thank you for this. And I appreciate it. I think your viewers are going to enjoy the connections and the topic.
Well, I'm going to tell you why this is important to me. But before we get to that, please take a minute or two and tell our viewers about yourself.
Well, I appreciate that opportunity as well. I've been a caregiver for my wife for now 35 years through a medical nightmare. She got hurt before I was married to her, before I met her, and we didn't really quite know what the extensive damage would be. But she had a significant limp and she'd had about 20 surgeries by the time I met her. Beautiful young woman. We met in college. She's a great singer. I was a piano player. Notice I used a great singer for her, not great piano player for me, but I do the best I can with what I got, Bruce. Mm-hmm. And we started making some great music together, and it was just it was really love at first sight for me. I stalked her and finally just made her marry me. No, but it's but the surgery started coming, right before we got married, right after we got married, and now she's had that I can count 80, and she's had about another 150 smaller procedures that I can count. She eventually lost both of her legs. She's been treated by over 100 doctors in 12 different hospitals and 7 different insurance companies. And the bills just continue to rack up, and it doesn't show any sign of slowing. I told her, I got to figure out what kind of world we're going to leave for her, Keith Richards, and Betty White. She's a tough gal, and she's been through the ringer. Orthopedically, she's a train wreck, and there's just a constant crisis, constant pain, just a lot of different challenges. And over the years, I thought, well, what do you say to people that are going through this kind of thing? And I remember I had a counselor look at me one time and said, I'd offer you a book to read, but you're the guy to write it. So I started writing, and I've written a couple of books, and people kept saying, you need to do a show. So I did a show, and it took off, and we're now on 200 stations weekly. And then my show is called For The Caregiver. And then I also do a pretty extensive podcast. I think our podcast and our broadcast are both the #1 shows for family caregivers, from what I understand. And it's not how to care give. I don't really spend a lot of time on that, Bruce. I spend a lot of time more on the heart issues going on with the caregiver, the headspace. If your head is squirrely, what's going to happen to your wallet? What's going to happen to your body? What's going to happen to your job? What's going to happen to your relationships? And so that's where I lock in on, because that's the battle. I can't tell you how to take care of your loved one any more than you can tell me how to take care of mine. But what we can do is come together and strengthen each other along the journey and say, okay, here's a path to safety that I found. Or that's a bad place down there. Don't go down there. I'm not a there kind of guy, but don't go down there. I've been there. I'm the crash test dummy of caregivers. And if you can fail at it, I've failed at it, but I've learned in these 3.5 decades a few things that I feel like can help my fellow caregivers stay a little stronger, a little healthier, and dare I say it, a little joyful while dealing with these things that are very painful.
Well, first off, we all wish your wife the very best,
Thank
and you. And what you're doing is above and beyond. And I promised you when we were chatting beforehand, I would explain to you why this topic is important to me. I used to work for a senior services provider, and I was a fundraiser, marketing, community relations, media relations, but mainly fundraising. And we had an Alzheimer's program, and it was a good program. And my responsibility was to raise money for it. And I was failing miserably. I couldn't bring in a plug nickel to save my life. And I did not know what I was doing wrong. I was talking to people about our Alzheimer's residents and what they were going through. And then don't ask me what it was, because when I told my boss why all of a sudden the money was coming in, I didn't remember then what happened, and it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Somebody who I was talking to said something to me, and something clicked upstairs. And I immediately changed the entire narrative from the person with Alzheimer's to the caregiver. And then the money started pouring in. I think I know why. I'm not certain, but that's why this is important to me.
The person, I just did a show on this with a fellow from Long Island who's got a movie out that I highly recommend for folks who are dealing with this. It's called Ice Cream in the Cupboard. It's on Amazon Prime, and you can do it. He's got a book out for it. His wife was diagnosed with early onset in her 50s, and she became extremely violent. He was so overwhelmed. She was confused. She had paranoia. She had fear, all those kinds of things, and she couldn't make qualified decisions. But the family was just in disarray, and he was coming unglued. And this is why your strategy worked. And it's not a strategy and a tactic. I don't want to sound like it's cold, but you understand this is where the core need is. Families are literally coming apart at the seams, and nobody really quite knows how to speak fluent caregiver to them. And that's why I wanted to come on with you today and talk about that for business. And let me give you an example.
Please.
P&K, your sponsors for the show, CPAs. This is a critical part of a caregiver's life, is to have good, solid financial accounting and advice, not just financial planners, which I believe is extremely important, but just making sure that everything is done properly, because it can get away from you so fast. And I look at some of the people that they serve, and I looked at their client list. How many in that group have a good bit of money and now have a special needs grandchild that's been diagnosed with autism or Down syndrome or something else that has happened, and they need to set up funds down the road for that child? The parents are overwhelmed, and these grandparents who have made a pretty good bit of money, or even just a decent amount of money, need somebody to give them some advice to help set up some structure so that these people are prepared for what's coming down the road, and that will outlive those grandparents. And that's the kind of thing that I wanted people to understand, how important it is. You're not just, if you tell people, well, take care of yourself, that is almost useless advice to a caregiver. I've had more people tell me that, and I just look at them and go, thank you, Captain Obvious. Well, what does that look like to take care of yourself? Well, one of the things it looks like is, do you have somebody that's helping you make good financial decisions? You know, I was in music school. I'm a pretty good pianist, and that's where my skill sets stop. And so I need people that around me that can help me. But nobody knew how to speak to my core needs. Nobody knew how to talk to me on business levels, whether it's professional career advice or anything else. And so I was floundering. And so this is one of the reasons I was so grateful for the opportunity to come on your show, because, okay, now we can have a conversation in a business environment where we're saying, okay, here's what it looks like to speak fluent caregiver, or speak caregiver. I speak fluent caregiver. I'll handle the heavy lifting on that. But here's a few things that you might want to know about a family caregiver that addresses the core need, and how your businesses and services can really help that individual. But you got to know how to speak to them. Otherwise, it's like you're over there trying to raise money for a great cause to help with this Alzheimer's care center, but you had to learn how to speak the language. And once you did, boom, success happened, and people were able to be helped because of your efforts. That is a beautiful example of what I'm talking about. So thank you for this privilege.
No, the privilege and honor are mine. Let me ask you something. Is there a difference between being a caregiver for a child and a caregiver for an adult?
Yes, very much so. One of them is my brother, for example, has a daughter with cerebral palsy. She's 32, and she is basically the equivalent of an 18-month-old mentally. She's immobile and nonverbal. The moment you have a child with special needs, you've got to start thinking beyond your own grave right away, knowing, depending on what that special need is, that you're probably not going to outlive this child. I got another friend of mine who's got a son with Down syndrome who's now 40. Well, it used to be that Down syndrome kids didn't live that long. And now my buddy he's 72, and he's realizing that his son is more than likely going to outlive him. And he's got to make preparations for that. He's got to have all kinds of things in place. With an adult, and it depends on what it is, but with an adult, there is a sense of agency that the individual has. My wife has,
What do you
for
mean
example,
by a sense of agency?
she is capable of making her own decisions. Some adults are not. She's capable of making her own decisions. Her body's just broken, and she lives with severe mobile impairments and things such as that. And she's in pain all the time, but she's able to make decisions for herself. And so if something happens to me, she would need a lot of help, but she doesn't need somebody to make all of her decisions for her.
She's not
And so there is
cognitively impaired.
No, she would argue that I am, but that's a different conversation.
Okay.
But it's now there have been times when she has been, when they've had her because of different things, reactions to medications and so forth, where she's had, seasons of this, but not as a rule, no. And so when you're dealing with somebody who has adult that is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia for someone, or some type of mental illness, there's a certain dynamic on that where they have medications, they can do that. But when you have a special needs child, and they can't grow to adult status normally, it's just a different dynamic. And I've watched this with my brother and his wife. Now, some kids can function somewhat normally through a lot of special training and so forth. I mean, if you got a kid who's visually impaired, for example, well, you could live a fairly productive life, I would argue, with visual impairments now, because they have so much adaptive training and equipment and so forth. So you're not dealing with the same thing of a cognitive impairment, and same thing with hearing or limb loss or whatever. So it depends on the situation. But for most parents, when you have a special needs child and you're diagnosed with that, I recommend three things. The first three things right off the bat. You have three conversations. You talk with your doctor. That's the most important thing. And to lay out a plan of care for this child, whether you need specialists involved or so forth, training, extra stuff at school or whatever. The second one is you talk to your clergy, because I think that's an incredibly important part of a family's life, is to have some type of trained clergy who could then help you maybe get with professional mental health counselors and so forth, support groups who can connect you to that world and also strengthen you just on a heart level in your spirit. And then the third thing is sit down with a financial planner. And that's what brings me to my meeting with you today. A financial planner is a critical part of a family with special needs children involved, because you've got to start thinking this way. Do you need a special needs trust? What is a special needs trust? All those kinds of things involved, where families are just almost at the mercy of a system if they don't have good counsel involved of how to manage their money and protect their assets. Does this child need to be on Medicaid? If so, what's involved with that? Is there a spin down program where they're going to have to get rid of family assets, or can they protect the family's assets so this thing doesn't just suck everything dry from them? These are things that financial counselors can answer, and answer well. But we got to know how to reach these people and let them know, okay, look, and you got to understand they're scared. That's if I leave you with nothing today for your clients, and for this audience today, that caregivers are scared. Every caregiver is struggling with three things I call the fog of caregivers: fear, obligation, and guilt. Now, I can unpack that for days, so I'm not going to do that
Yeah.
on your show. But let's just talk about the fear for a moment. I live with a situation where it's almost like Damocles' sword, hanging over your head by a thread. Most caregivers are one sprained ankle from this thing turning into a Greek tragedy. We live with a lot of fear. And so when somebody comes along and wants to sell us something or offer their products and services, please understand you're not dealing with somebody just walked in off the street into your shop. You're dealing with people who are living with real fear of, okay, what is going to happen to us? And if you understand that and just speak to them like people on a heart level, you'd be amazed at how you're able to connect them to business and service, and make sure you do a good job with it. I'm assuming that people are not trying to be shysters with it. I'm assuming that they can really help, but understand why that helps. For example, life insurance. You don't have to beat people over the head and have some kind of great sales technique to convince a caregiver of the importance of life insurance. Let them know, just ask them, what's your plan in case something happens to you?
Peter, we're making an assumption, both of us. You know what a caregiver is. I know what a caregiver is. I know who a caregiver is. You know who a caregiver is. How would you define caregiver?
Well, Jeff Foxworthy and I did a bit on this, on You Might Be a Caregiver If. And
Okay,
I remember
I'm acquainted with the style.
AARP asked me the same question in an interview one time. And they said, what about people who don't know that they're a caregiver? How do you say to them, how do you know if you're a caregiver? And I, for whatever reason, just popped off. Well, if you have a professional carpet cleaner on retainer, you're probably a caregiver.
Okay.
They thought that was funny. They said, you and Jeff ought to do this together. So I called him up and I said, you want to do this with me? And video thing. And he said, sure, write out some jokes and we'll do it. I said, these aren't jokes. This is my life, And so, if you've ever hooked up your dog to your wife's wheelchair just to see if it would work, and I've got footage of that.
You might be a caregiver.
A caregiver is somebody who voluntarily, okay, I'm not talking about people who go to work, punch a clock, and come home at the end of the day. They are caregiving, but a family caregiver is somebody who voluntarily puts themselves between a vulnerable loved one and even worse disaster.
That's
somebody
a great definition.
Somebody who has a vulnerable loved one is somebody who has an impairment, some type of chronic impairment. People say, well, I'm a parent, my kids are, yes, but there is an expectation that those children without any other disease or affliction are going to grow up to be normal kids with their own sense of agency and make the decisions for themselves. My niece, for example, cannot do that. Gracie my wife is extremely vulnerable. And so I put myself between her and even worse disaster to do things. I mean, she doesn't have the cognitive impairments, but she's got significant physical impairments. And so this is what we do. We put ourselves between them and even worse disaster, and we do it without pay, and we do it at great risk to ourselves. Our wallets.
You just said you do it without pay. I was under the impression that there's now a government program where a caregiver will be paid by the government, a family caregiver.
There are some cases where that can happen. And there are other it's not consistent across the country, particularly for the type of caregivers that there are out there. If you've got
state, it's not federal.
Well, I don't think it's federal yet. And I don't know that even if it is federal, that it's going to apply across the board. Mm-hmm. For example, if you got aging parents and they just need a little extra assistance and they're cantankerous and they're slow and old, well, you're not going to get paid to care for them. Yeah. So those are things that if you have a special needs child, there are things available out there.
I want to talk about one of the things you mentioned, guilt. And one of the problems or situations I have been in, even after I left the senior care world, was talking to people who had they couldn't bring themselves to institutionalize, meaning putting their loved one into a nursing home. It was almost literally killing them. The guilt of even thinking about it. How do you address that issue?
And that is a great question. And every caregiver will go through this, not just over institution, putting them in institution, but families, especially children, feel guilty just for bringing the child into the world. So there's so much guilt out there driving this, or they made a promise 40 years ago, don't put me in a nursing home. And so the caregiver will almost kill themselves to live up to that 40-year-old promise. And what I tell people is, okay, look, here's where you are. Now, what is the best way to serve this individual? Is it for you to deplete everything about you and for you to quit your job or whatever? Is this working for you? And a lot of times you just ask a question. And I let them know that healthy caregivers make better caregivers. It's hard to take care of somebody when you yourself are in a bad situation. Sorry, my Harry alarm system's going off here.
That's
we live in rural Montana, so when anybody comes to visit us, it's always an event. But if you're not in a healthy position, emotionally and physically, let's put financially on hold for just a moment. How in the world is this going to work out for you? And what's your plan if something happens to you? And some people you're not able to take care of at home. Like this guy I just interviewed the other day, his wife was violent. I mean, literally violent. She was punching out the staff that came to work during the day while he could go to work. And so they had to put her in a facility. This is happening over and over. Some things require 24/7 nursing care. I had a lady one time that, this is kind of a strange example, but I had a lady that called me one time and she said, I wanted you to help me get my husband out of prison. He has Alzheimer's and I want to bring him home and take care of him, so he has his last couple of days with dignity, or a couple of years. Well, he's 91 years old and he was in prison. And I said, what's he in prison for? She said, well, he's a sex offender. And I said, and he was sentenced when he was in his 80s. And now he's got Alzheimer's and he's in prison. And she said, well, he's not guilty. Well, okay. I'm not going to have that debate. I'm just going to just giving me the facts. We're going to stay with these facts that he is in prison and he does have Alzheimer's. And I said, okay, what kind of health are you in? And she was a heavy smoker. She was not in very good health. This was his second wife. She was about 20 years younger than him, maybe more. I think maybe more than that. Yeah. And I said, are you in a position financially where you can take care of this man at home by yourself with Alzheimer's? She said, well, not really. And I said, he's a sex offender. So no matter if he's got Alzheimer's or not, he's going to have to register with the sex offender registry. Are you in a position that you may have to move if you're too close to a school, or for example? She said, well, no, not really. And I said, does he even know who you are? She said, sometimes. And she was so torn up with guilt over the whole thing. It was just a mess. And I was out here at our place in Montana, and I looked down the hill, and there's a lean-to that my father-in-law had built for the horses to get out of the wind. And it was open on offset on one side, and the other side was open on this side. So whichever the wind was blowing, they could get in there and just get out of the very, very cold Montana winds that come sometimes in the wintertime. And I told her about it. I said, it's not a barn. It's not a great structure, but it gets them out of the wind, and it stops that wind from just cutting them in two. And I said, right now that prison is kind of like that for your husband. And it's a place where he's being taken care of. And you don't have to face the gale force winds that are coming from Alzheimer's. Let the prison deal with that. And you build your life, you get healthy yourself. And it's okay. You don't have to feel guilty about it. This is his life. This is his journey. Doesn't have to be yours. We know how once you get a diagnosis with Alzheimer's, we know how that's going to end. And it's not going to end pretty.
In the nursing home, I would get into a fight, I think twice, and then they stopped bothering me, with the social workers, because someone would enter the nursing home with early stage onset of Alzheimer's, they would sign a release. Remember, I was a fundraiser, public relations. They would sign a release giving me permission to use their photo, to use their image for marketing purposes. But when they reached a later stage in the disease, I refused to honor that release. And I would say to the social workers, that's not the same person. He's
Exactly.
not around anymore. He doesn't know. You know, I almost, and I caught myself, and I apologize to anybody who's listening who may be offended. I almost said, that person is dead. It's just that his heart and his brain don't know it. And
that's not an inaccurate statement.
yeah, it's not a kind statement, but yeah,
Well,
it's not inaccurate.
And as this lady, she was so wrapped up in guilt over this thing with her husband. And I don't know all the details of the case or anything. I just know the reality that he had Alzheimer's in prison. We know how his story is going to end. The question is, do we know how her story is going to end?
There you go.
And this is what I talk to caregivers about. And so if I'm talking to an assisted living company, a senior company, or somebody who has these kinds of programs, one of the things I talk to them is, yes, talk to the patient if you can, but look at that caregiver and just ask the caregiver, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Every caller that calls to my show, the first question I ask is, how are you feeling? And you'd be amazed how many can't answer it. And I have to stop them multiple times, often. They'll give me a blow off answer like, oh, we're doing okay, but boy, I really hate my mother, kind of thing. But a lot of times they'll say, well, she's doing okay, or our situation, or we, and they're not speaking in first person singular.
Yeah.
And if you really want to help a caregiver, and if you think your products and services really can help a caregiver, give them the space and the freedom and and give the compassion to let them answer in first person singular. There will be tears involved. I'm certain of it. There may be some anger involved, but don't try to fix it. Just simply listen, and then see if you can't say, look, here's what we offer. And I think this would be helpful to you. If nothing else, they walk away from your office saying, these people listened to me. These people heard me. They cared about me. And, you don't have to close every deal right that moment. You know that more than most people do.
Yep.
You know that. But what you do want to do is conduct yourself in a way that your business reputation gets known for being a business that really considers the person, the client. I hate that phrase, the customer's always right. I hate that phrase because I don't believe it.
No.
I think the customer's rarely right.
But the customer
But they're
is
always the
customer.
They're always the customer.
There you go.
And they come in with, and if you got somebody coming into your, particularly if you're in that health arena, these people are in the fog of caregivers, fear, obligation, and guilt. And that obligation can turn into resentment about that fast.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with people who may be torqued by fear and resentment. They're torn up because, Exodus says we got to honor our mother and father. And yet look at, he said, no, whoa. And I've told that to more people about that particular passage in scripture that seems to lock up people. And I'm one of the few, I think I'm the only one with any kind of national presence on it, that lumps in family members of alcoholics and addicts as caregivers now, because it's a chronic impairment. And
That's
so when you're
interesting.
dealing with an alcohol, well, I came to that conclusion a long time ago, and I hammer that nail pretty hard to let people know that if you have an alcoholic or addict in your family, you are a caregiver. They have a chronic impairment. I don't care if they're in recovery or out of recovery, it doesn't matter. They've got to work their program. And if they're sober, great. If they're not sober, they still have, but you've got that journey as a caregiver. And
Never thought of that.
I had a guy call in and he was struggling with it because his father had fallen and he'd been an abusive alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'm struggling. I don't know what. And I said, he quoted that scripture, honor your mother and father. And I said, it says honor your mother and father. It doesn't say honor alcoholism. It doesn't say honor Alzheimer's. You don't have to honor the disease. You honor the person. And sometimes that means making unilateral decisions on what is best for you to do in this situation, what is best for the unit to do. They'll put a caregiver's needs so far beyond themselves. It's their joy, their happiness at my expense.
It's the example that I like to give, and we've got to end, is when you have to take the car keys away from your father, grandfather, mother, because they have Alzheimer's. And for some idiotic reason, there is no law that says that when you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the doctor should take the car keys away from you. So,
well, good luck passing good luck passing legislation that makes sense.
Yeah. Peter,
as you can tell, I love this subject.
And what you're doing is truly a magnificent service. And I want to put up, and I apologize for messing this up,
that's all right,
your contact information. Is there anything that I asked you, that I didn't ask you, that you'd like to end on?
I would like to, we touched on it briefly, and I just want to end with this. Healthy caregivers make better caregivers. It's just that simple. And if you have a product or service and you're wanting to connect to a caregiver, understand the goal is not to make them happy. The goal is for them to be healthier, physically, emotionally, financially, professionally, spiritually, whatever is in your services to offer. Consider that this is a path to healthiness for them. You can't make me happy. That's my choice. But what you can do is facilitate me becoming healthier. And that is a great gift to give to someone. And whether it's, life insurance or senior care services, whatever it is, I don't care. If it's somebody who works on your car, if you're a mechanic, ask that single mom of a special needs child, make sure that her tires are rotated and balanced properly and that her car is safe. When's a good time for a mom with special needs child to have her car break down? There are so many services where things intersect with caregivers. 65 million of us are doing this right now in this country. So Bruce, what you've done today is highlight this group. I know I went way over my time. I have
no, that's fine. That's fine.
This is why I'm a 12-stepper for people who talk a lot, called On and On and On and On. But
that's all right. There are people who talk and say nothing, and there are people who talk and say a great deal. And that, my friend, is you. And you provided a phenomenal service. You're providing a phenomenal service. Wish you and your wife the very best. Thank you very much for having taken the time to come on. I'm Bruce Hurwitz. Thank you for watching. And as I always like to say, these days, stay safe. Thank you.